Tonight, veterans, royalty and world leaders honour those who made the ultimate sacrifice 80 years ago on D-Day. The King led tributes on the eve of the anniversary, praising the courage, resilience and solidarity of those who fought.
We are all eternally in their debt.
While paratroopers from Britain, the United States, Canada and Belgium paid their respects. And tonight, special tributes across France, including a speech by the Princess Royal. We'll bring you that moment live from Bio Cemetery. Also on the programme, Israel accused of dropping white phosphorus into civilian areas in Lebanon. Our special correspondent Alex Crawford reports on the pictures raising human rights concerns. A suspected war criminal in the eyes of the International Criminal Court, but tonight I hear from one of 247 US politicians who've backed Benjamin Netanyahu against the ICC.
If we're leaving it to other people whose moralities are different, whose political objectives are different, frankly, to make these decisions, I think we're giving up our national sovereignty.
And a call for action against the godfathers of climate chaos. The head of the UN says fossil fuel companies should be banned from advertising, just like big tobacco. That's all coming up on The World with me, Dominic Waghorn. For 80 years, we have remembered their sacrifice. The brave D-Day soldiers who, on this night in 1944, were boarding planes and boats ready to travel to Normandy. Collectively, Allied troops were in strong numbers, more than 150,000, and yet every one of them knew the mission into Nazi-occupied France was one they may never return from. It is difficult to comprehend what emotions they must have felt then and to this day. And that is why we not only remember them, but listen to them. Today, they had the ear of the King. Their stories of heroism and how they brought about an end of the Second World War are treasured. Tomorrow, on the anniversary itself, it will be the turn of presidents to pay their respects. There will once again be heartfelt tributes, pomp and ceremony, but also sadness. This image of a tearful Queen Camilla earlier today spoke to an emotion shared by many, a fear that this may be one of the last times we get to hear the stories of D-Day soldiers in their own words. 225 veterans travelled to Normandy for the last major anniversary 5 years ago. This year, only 23 did so. So how will the legacy of the greatest generation live on? Here's our royal correspondent, Laura Bundock.
80 years has passed, but D-Day is not forgotten. It remains the world's biggest ever seaborne invasion. Only a few can still say, "I was there." And with royalty front row, veteran Eric Bateman took centre stage and brought the VIP box to its feet.
I'm lucky to be here 80 years later with two of my great-grandchildren. I'm proud to be here today to honour them and to make sure they will always be remembered. Thank you.
And from the King, whose cancer has cancelled so much in his calendar, a message of tribute.
Let us once again commit ourselves always to remember, cherish and honour those who served that day, for we are all eternally in their debt.
The story of D-Day was retold with music and readings from Portsmouth, the point of departure for thousands of troops.
Too many never returned. They remain in some corner of a foreign field that is forever England. We will always remember those who served and those who waved them off.
From the skies above Portsmouth, a salute to those who sacrificed everything.
Well, here because any now that I begin to be a bit useful.
This is one event the King did not want to miss. He knows how much these milestones matter in commemorating a generation who 80 years ago today were preparing for journeys and battles with no guarantee of return.
It began the beginning of the end of the war. Otherwise we'd had the whole of Europe was against us, a small island.
Sad in one way because it may be the last one for our generation.
It made me cry, and I could sing Vera Lynn's songs quite happily.
The D-Day veterans are dwindling in number, but a younger generation also gathered to remember those who risked and gave their lives and helped change the course of history. Laura Bundock, Sky News, Portsmouth.
Today, the attention was on those who were there on the beaches 80 years ago. Several veterans travelled across the Channel to France to pay their respects to those who didn't make it to Normandy. Our royal correspondent, Rhiannon Mills, has this.
From the skies, this was marking the start of commemorations this time, not battle. Paratroopers from the 16 Air Assault Brigade recreating that dramatic drop made by their brave predecessors 80 years ago, their show of respect. Up the coast in Arromanches at Gold Beach, people have travelled from all over the world. Dressing up is their way of genuinely paying tribute, like Szymon and his friends from Poland.
Very nice to show because in museum and in books you can't touch the exhibits. You can't wear the garment and so on. And right here you can simply touch. You can look how it works and so on.
Will and son Sam drove from North Buckinghamshire in what they call their precious metal veteran.
It's important to keep the memory going. As the veterans are unfortunately moving on, we feel we need to keep the memory going, and the best way we can do it is to dress and respect them and bring the vehicles and keep them going.
It brings back the reality of the face of what happened. I mean, these sunglasses my uncle wore during the war, and he was driving one of these trucks. So I feel it's important to just keep that memory alive.
At Bayeux, you find a more stark reminder. A Second World War cemetery of over 4,000 graves. Gathering for a service, veterans, their families and dignitaries, including Princess Anne, watched as with a little help, one of those brave men took to his feet.
During one of the breaks after spending the day on the beach, I was wondering when it was all going to end. And around 5 o'clock when the tide come in, we refloated. And I pinched myself and thought, I'm still here. And it was a sigh of relief to think I was coming back to England. And the only thing I'm sorry about was leaving the lads behind.
Bayeux was the first major town they liberated after the landings. In the cathedral, they prayed before a procession of remembrance. With so many events focused here, this really has felt like a town that's wanted to make every effort to say a personal thank you and show gratitude to those veterans who may never come back before handing them over to an international stage. Tomorrow, President Macron, President Biden, King Charles and dozens of other dignitaries will travel here as the world has its chance to reflect and remember. Rhiannon Mills, Sky News in Bayeux.
Well, our correspondent Adam Parsons is in Ranville at the famous Pegasus Bridge Memorial. Adam, thanks for joining us. What's the mood there? What are they remembering happened there 80 years ago, and how are they going to commemorate it tonight?
First of all, to say where we are, this is pretty much where D-Day started, because in a few minutes after midnight on June the 6th, 44, gliders arrived here with extraordinary precision, bearing in mind how rudimentary that technology was, landed not far from where I'm standing, and sees the bridge behind me. In fact, this is a replacement bridge. The original one is in a museum round the corner, and that was the precipitant for everything that followed. The success of this mission, the complete shock that it caused for German troops. So this will be remembered tonight specifically. There is every year a vigil around midnight to mark the moment when effectively D-Day began. And as you can see, there are hundreds and hundreds of people here, collection of those who've come to visit France, who've come from America, from Britain, from all around. There's locals, and also I have to say there are British soldiers here who are out, spent the day remembering and marking this occasion with that parachute drop that we had this afternoon. And this occasion is always a blend, Dominic. It's a blend of commemoration, very, very sombre remembrance, but it's also, in a sense, a celebration of the triumph of D-Day. The parachute drop that happened today with over 300 paratroopers falling was, I think, a demonstration of the pride that they feel, the link they still grasp onto between what they do and what happened here 80 years ago.
And later on, we're going to have I think, an event at midnight. Is there a sense of suspense and anticipation building up to that? Do you feel the atmosphere is building up, or is it sort of beginning to fade a bit as the day ends there?
No, a lot of these people are here specifically for that event. I think it is seen here as a really, really important moment to reflect, to mark what happened, and really to treasure the central role that this patch of ground had. And I think when you come here, Dominic, what does strike you is that you have this big stretch of water here. You have a kind of almost a marshy area over there. These young men had to do something that no one had done before, had to land gliders, paratroopers in a very small patch of ground. And that was one of the keys to seizing this bridge, to that start of D-Day. And what is marked here from midnight is the fact that against the odds, they succeeded. They landed gliders maybe like 100 feet from their target. And just to put that into some kind of context, I spoke to a paratrooper earlier who's been trained to the highest possible level. And he said that he hadn't been interested in history until he joined the parachute regiment and had then been told about what happened here. And he said, I simply couldn't believe what these people did. They came at night in fog. They came in this glider that was effectively a box with wings. And he said, and they landed it exactly where they wanted to. And he said, even with the technology we have now, I don't know if we'll be able to. One little fact for you, though. This is called Pegasus Bridge because those paratroopers who came from the 6th Airborne Division, British troops, got a Pegasus logo on the left-hand side of their uniform. Such is the respect that was felt and is still felt in this corner of France. They renamed the bridge in their honour, and those paratroopers still have the Pegasus logo on their shoulders. It ripples through history, and I think here, as much as anywhere in the world, you feel those ripples of time, that what happened here 80 years ago is still shaping our lives and our world.
Adam Parsons at Pegasus Bridge, thank you very much. Well, our royal commentator, Alistair Bruce, has been taking a look at how events unfolded on that all-important day.
D-Day, the largest amphibious invasion of all time, and the beginning of the end of the Second World War. 80 years ago, on the 6th of June 1944, more than 150,000 Allied forces from the UK, US and Canada took part in a combined naval, air and land assault, codenamed Operation Overlord, on Nazi-occupied France. Their aim, to make a foothold in Nazi territory to liberate occupied Europe. But hundreds of miles of fortifications known as the Atlantic Wall stood in their way. The operation had been planned for months, and thousands of troops gathered along the south coast of England, waiting for the optimum conditions to launch the invasion. To ensure success, the Allies deployed a series of deception campaigns to fool the Nazis and deflect German resources from the real target, with bombing raids carried out right across northern France. After a day's delay due to unfavourable weather conditions, Operation Neptune, the naval aspect of the invasion, began around midnight of the 6th of June. An hour later, and the first British and American planes flew over Normandy, dropping around 13,000 paratroopers behind enemy lines and attacking key strategic German positions from above. D-Day had begun. Various problems, including navigation, communication, and heavy enemy fire, meant that many of the paratroopers landed off course, leaving scores dead or missing. Attention then turned to the beach assaults. German military leaders were expecting an invasion, but they believed the attacks from the air were only an attempt to divert their attention before an attack further up the coast near to Calais. The element of surprise helped tens of thousands of British troops to establish a foothold on beaches codenamed Gold and Sword. The Canadian forces themselves had another beach called Juno, and 73,000 Americans arrived in small landing craft on the westernmost beaches of Omaha and Utah. At Omaha, they were confronted with relentless machine gun and artillery fire. Many of the landing craft became floating targets, with casualties beginning to mount. Those who landed at Utah Beach, which had been added as a target at the 11th hour to allow an assault on Cherbourg, were also affected by poor weather. At Gold Beach, British troops faced stiff opposition, but a combination of air support, precise naval shelling, and sheer bravery allowed them to secure a beachhead and push on to capture strategically important locations, allowing the flow of essential supplies. At Juno Beach, almost half the first wave of Canadian troops were killed or injured. Those that did survive managed to take more territory that first day than the British and Americans. And British forces landing at Sword Beach too faced strong resistance. It took until the afternoon for the paratroopers and commandos to fully take control of their intended target. By the end of the day, Allied forces were holding key areas of northern France's coast. Over the next month, US troops were able to push way inland, creating a safe zone around the port of Cherbourg, where they could then land more men and more equipment. Gradually, they continued pushing through northern France, and within 3 months, they liberated Paris. On D-Day itself, the US Army counted almost 3,500 troops dead or missing, with more than 6,500 more wounded. The Canadians lost 335 men, and almost 1,000 were injured. And while the British Army and Navy did not publish figures, one historian later estimated that around 3,000 had died, gone missing, or been wounded. Yet, it could have been far worse. Prime Minister Sir Winston Churchill admitted that he had been expecting the toll to be dire, telling his wife that 10,000 would be killed on that first day. While those three nations were the main driving force of the invasion, it is important to say that a multitude of countries contributed to its enormous success.
Alistair Bruce there. Well, let's bring in our royal correspondent, Rhiannon Mills, who is in Bayeux, Normandy, where events have been taking place. Rhiannon, a day of tributes, in particular from the King, but we're going to hear more soon, I think, from another member of the royal family where you are.
That's right. So while the King, Queen and also Prince William, of course, were in Portsmouth today, important for them to mark the place where this evening those troops would have been preparing to make the unknown trip. I think we can hear from Princess Anne now.
Launch Operation Overlord, what we now call D-Day, the largest sea and airborne invasion the world has ever seen. After 5 years of war, all that time training and waiting, who knows what those sailors, soldiers and airmen felt. 80 years ago today, charged with storming the Normandy coastline and beginning the campaign to free Western Europe from Nazi tyranny. One of those sailors was my husband's uncle, Sub-Lieutenant Keith Simons, who, at the age of 20, was in command of 3 landing craft at Gold Beach in the first wave on D-Day. Recalling in his memoirs the evening of 5th of June, he wrote, "At last, it was time for our briefing. Our confidence was dented by predictions that casualties in the first wave were likely to be heavy. Everyone was quite subdued, but it was all very matter-of-fact. They were in those days. After supper, we sat around making light conversation and listening to the chaplain playing his violin. My cabin companion was a captain in the Green Howards, a charming man who had been a solicitor before the war. We talked about what he would do when the war was over. Sadly, he was killed in France only a few weeks later. Bayeux was close to the landing beaches, and it was the first city to be liberated by the British on the 7th of June. The city's hospitals were soon full of the wounded from the surrounding battlefield. For those who could not be saved, this was their final resting place. It is the largest Commonwealth cemetery of the Second World War in France and contains 4,140 Allied graves. It is my honour as President of the Commonwealth War Graves Commission to continue to protect their legacy. The epitaphs on the headstones here capture the grief of those who loved these men. One mother's words are, "He is not dead, whose memory lives in hearts that know and loved him." 80 years on, let their memory still live on in our hearts.
Well, let's go back to our royal correspondent, Rhiannon Mills, who is in Bayeux, who's been listening to Princess Anne there. Rhiannon, a very moving day and also an important day for the King, giving the first speech he's given really since his diagnosis of his illness.
I think for the royal family, they wanted to make sure that they were front and centre when it came to remembering that moment 80 years ago. They, like the rest of us, are so conscious of the fact that those veterans who were just in their teens, some of them, when they hit those Normandy beaches 80 years ago, are now in their 90s, their early hundreds, and won't be with us for much longer. And so for them, I think it was so important for the royals to pay the ultimate tribute to them, to meet them, to give those speeches. I think what's interesting listening to what Princess Anne said there is often a lot of these speeches, they've been bringing it back to the personal. So she was talking about how her husband's uncle was involved in the D-Day landings. And making that speech there at Bayeux Cemetery, which is the largest Commonwealth Second World War cemetery in this region, 4,000 graves there. We were there earlier, and you can't help but be moved when you walk along those rows upon rows of headstones, as Princess Anne mentioned, and you see the ages, 19, 20. It's just horrific to think about how young some of those men were when they lost their lives, and especially striking when, like I have, you have the opportunity to talk to those who did manage to make it back and who simply miss their friends and have wanted to be over here to pay their tributes as much as they can. Of course, tomorrow we're going to see more big international events involving, yes, the King, the Queen and Prince William, but also dignitaries from right around the world. And while a lot of those celebrations, the commemorations, have been here in Bayeux today, tomorrow, right along the coastline, along those 5 beaches where the landings took place, we're going to see world leaders marking their moments of what was important to their nations at the time, but also think, for many people, hopefully taking some time to reflect on what the men at the time fought for, fighting for freedom and ultimately to achieve peace.
Rhiannon Mills, thank you very much. Rhiannon Mills there from Bayeux in Normandy. Well, you're watching The World with me, Dominic Waghorn. Coming up, we'll explore a claim from one of the world's leading human rights groups saying that white phosphorus is being used as a weapon by Israel on residential areas across the northern border in Lebanon.
Westminster may seem far from Grimsby and Cleethorpes, but not for long. With a general election around the corner, we're bringing you Sunak versus Starmer, live from Grimsby. Putting their cases forward and facing questions from a live audience. Who will convince you to give them the keys to this place? The battle for number 10. Get the full story first on Sky News.
It's extremely worrying because they are quite capable of overwintering. They're found up even in places like Nepal in their natural habitat, so our winters are not a barrier to them. There were a load of nests found last year, and some of them were found quite late in the year, which means new queens will have hatched and gone off and made nests. Each hornet nest could be producing a minimum of 10 queens and maybe up to 100 queens that would be overwintering. So you can see how exponentially they can spread. The individual hornets will fly 25 to 30 miles before setting up a nest. Once they set up a nest, they will operate within about a half-kilometre radius of where that nest is. But it's very, very worrying that they're here. They're in a part of the UK where we have some of our rarest bees, things like the shrill carder bee, the brown-banded carder bee. Some of their strongholds are in that sort of Thames Gateway area in the sort of Kent and Essex environ, which of course is close to the area where all of those nests have been found. If in doubt, report it, basically. Even if you're not 100% sure, report it. There is a hotline to report them on. You can get an app on your phone to report them. People will come out and investigate. And rather than just sort of kill one, it is better to report it, because what they really need to do is to trace the nest. An individual worker hornet being killed is not going to have any great effect. But if you can find an individual worker hornet and trace it back to where the nest is, then they can destroy the nest before new queens are incubated and able to set up more hornets in the following year. The worrying thing is that possibly the proverbial cat is out of the bag. They have now already successfully bred and overwintered in the UK. It will be catastrophic for bee populations, for pollination within our country. There are no real predators for them over here, so they will do extremely well. Our bees are not used to them, so they will fall easy prey.
Well, welcome back. Israel has been accused of unlawfully dropping white phosphorus over residential buildings in neighbouring Lebanon. A report by Human Rights Watch says that Israeli forces deployed the substance in at least 17 towns since October last year. Once exposed to oxygen, white phosphorus ignites and inflicts serious and sometimes fatal burns. The report's publication comes at a time of increased tensions, with Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu warning today that his forces are prepared for what he called strong action in the north. Our special correspondent Alex Crawford has this report.
There's a lot of pressure building on the Lebanese-Israeli border, and it's escalated massively over the past few days. This latest round of Hezbollah attacks is clearly testing tempers, with both sides now threatening all-out war. The Israeli War Cabinet's emergency meeting was quickly followed by the Israeli leader visiting troops and emergency workers in the north. We are ready to strike, he seemed to be suggesting.
Whoever thinks that he will hurt us and we will sit idly by is making a big mistake. We are prepared for a very strong action in the north.
The Israelis have been hitting further inside Lebanon. If we look again, the pictures are hazy but appear to show white phosphorus being used. The claims come on top of an investigation by Human Rights Watch, which details widespread use of white phosphorus by the Israeli military in Lebanon. The human rights group focused on the months immediately after October the 7th, when these areas were full of residents. The use of white phosphorus to drive out people, burn land, or fired indiscriminately in populated areas is outlawed under international law.
This documentation, I think, should raise the alarms with states that are providing weapons or arms with Israel, because there is a real risk that such arms are going to be used in violation or may be used in violation of international law, whether it's in Gaza but also in Lebanon.
Our own investigations in Lebanon found evidence of widespread burning of land, although we cannot confirm by whom. When we contacted the IDF, they vehemently denied using white phosphorus illegally. But they said they do possess smokescreen shells that include white phosphorus that are legal under international law. These shells are used by the IDF for creating smoke screens, they said, and not for targeting or causing fires, and are not defined under law as incendiary weapons. But tens of thousands have been forced out of their homes on both sides of the border, 100,000 in Lebanon alone, according to the Foreign Ministry, causing a displacement crisis. Many of them are farmers, like this man, who told us of the scorched earth policy they believe is being used against them.
When the phosphorus is fired, it drops something like powder. It sprays something yellow and has a bad smell. All our land in the south is affected by it. In the beginning of the war, they dropped a lot of phosphorus.
The many Lebanese residents we've been talking to over several months appear to back up the investigation by Human Rights Watch. We found residents who don't want to be identified in Kefir Keller, who showed us pictures from an attack the night before we arrived. It looks very much like white phosphorus being fired from Israel.
They're trying to suffocate us, start fires and burn all our land. Why do they want to hit us? Why do they want to hit a civilian area? Are they allowed to hit a civilian area?
But the Israeli military insists it's hitting Hezbollah targets from where the Hamas ally is launching attacks against Israel. The villagers we spoke to say these attacks are unpredictable. The fires are difficult to extinguish and they've suffered breathing difficulties. They're one of the few families still in the area, nervous about speaking because of possible Israeli retribution, but also worried about incurring Hezbollah wrath by talking to foreign media. The area was clearly still very active whilst we were there. And now the Arab media is awash with reports of diplomatic warnings from several Western envoys about an imminent Israeli attack on Lebanon. Prepare for war, one is thought to have told the Lebanese. The escalation over the past few days has only fueled those worries of all-out war between the two neighbours. Alex Crawford, Sky News.
Well, to discuss those disturbing pictures from southern Lebanon and those renewed fears of this conflict expanding across the border into Lebanon, happy to say I'm joined by the Lebanese journalist from Al Arabi TV, Jad Hossein. Jad, thank you for joining us tonight. I mean, how worried are the Lebanese that the rhetoric is intensifying and also, it seems, the exchange of fire across this border?
The fear is there, definitely, since the escalation has been ongoing for months now, without any political solution at hand, at least as far as we know. The Americans had an envoy, which is Amos Hochstein, which is trying to secure some kind of new rules of engagement in the south between Hezbollah and Israel. And until now, there is no clear solution to this problem, as well as the whole ceasefire also in Gaza, which launched this whole escalation in the south. So the fear is there.
I think it's fair to say that as those American and also French efforts to ease the situation in Lebanon happen, they seem to coincide with efforts to bring about some kind of ceasefire deal in Gaza. Is there a possibility of the tensions in southern Lebanon easing without any deal in Gaza, or are the two completely kind of contingent on each other?
Until now, they seem to be contingent, at least in the rhetoric of Hezbollah. But one has to also put in mind the fact that once the conflict in Gaza ends, hopefully, that doesn't mean that directly things would slow down in the Lebanese south, because there is a wing in the Israeli government and the Israeli military which is saying clearly that the situation with Hezbollah is untenable for the Israelis because of the damages that he is incurring inside of Israel. So the last statement of Netanyahu also said that maybe after Rafah, the northern front would be dealt with. So one has to wait and see how the Israelis deal with all of these.
And in terms of what Hezbollah are doing, what do you think their game is? Because they're losing commanders, they're losing a lot of fighters, and yet they seem to be continuing these efforts to attack Israel. It's kind of tit for tat, but they're not relenting at all. What do you think Hezbollah's game is here?
I believe Hezbollah's game, if you take a look at his behavior, isn't dragging Lebanon to an all-out war, it seems, because it had many opportunities to do that when Israel assassinated the Hamas leader in the southern area of Beirut, or even their leaders, their army commanders. They didn't. So I believe that what they are trying to do is to have new rules of engagement to deter the Israelis from escalating from their end if their efforts in Gaza fail at the end.
And when Benjamin Netanyahu threatens a bigger offensive into Lebanon, is that something that the Lebanese are worried about, or do they see it as bluffing and blustering?
You have to worry about it because this kind of escalation has been going on for now 8 months, I guess. And you have displaced in Lebanon more than 100,000 and also in Israel. So one has to fear of what might happen. But also this big talk and hard talk between the two has been ongoing for 8 months. And it's part of the negotiations, I believe, that is ongoing indirectly between the two. So one fears maybe a miscommunication, because until now it seems that both sides do not have big interest into an all-out war. Maybe the fragile situation with the Israeli government and Netanyahu trying to stay in power might lead some factions in that government to maybe push for a wider war on their northern front. But until now, these escalations have been calculated, let's say.
The Lebanese are known for their resilience and for their spirit, but I mean, things economically so difficult for the Lebanese and these very worrying times. Is that all taking its toll on that famous spirit of the Lebanese?
Yeah, sure. It has been taking its toll for the maybe last 5 years. You have more than 350,000 people who left the country since the economic crisis. And you have paralysis in the government. You cannot elect a president. And the situation is dire on all fronts. And maybe it's one of the reasons Hezbollah is being really not very keen on escalating and maybe dragging the country into an all-out war, because he's one of the responsibles, he's one of the leaders in the country, in the government. So they'll be also responsible for the post-war efforts, and you don't have the economic means to restore what could be destructed, and also you would have to deal with lots of social and political problems that would occur after such a war. So maybe that's one of the reasons that the issues are being calculated.
Jad Hossan, thank you so much for your time. Great to get your insights on the worrying situation in Lebanon. It's great to have you on The World. This is The World with me, Dominic Waghorn. After the break, the US House of Representatives sends a strong message. The Republican majority votes for legislation that would sanction the International Criminal Court as its chief prosecutor seeks the arrest of Benjamin Netanyahu. But could the bill ever become law? Welcome back to America now. US lawmakers have passed legislation aiming to sanction the International Criminal Court. Chief Prosecutor of the ICC, Hakim, is seeking to arrest two top Israeli officials, including Benjamin Netanyahu. Despite the bill passing, it was the Republican majority House of Representatives that gave it the green light. Up next will be the Senate, where it's unlikely to attract strong Democratic support. Earlier, I spoke to Republican Representative Nathaniel Moran, who is one of the 247 US politicians who have chosen to back Mr. Netanyahu.
I think you start from the very beginning about who should be making these decisions, and the International Criminal Court is not the entity that should be making the decisions about whether or not Israel or the United States or other countries around this world are exercising its right to defend itself in this moment in history. And whether or not that passes their moral test or their legal test, it's the wrong entity to be making that decision. In fact, that intrudes upon the sovereignty of the United States, who has not opted into the ICC, or Israel the same way. If we're leaving it to other people whose moralities are different, whose political objectives are different, frankly, to make these decisions, I think we're giving up our national sovereignty.
But who's going to bring people to justice if there is no International Criminal Court? People like Vladimir Putin and his Russian cronies, if people like you undermine the whole idea of a criminal court for the world?
Well, there's ways to work in partnership against totalitarian regimes and tyrannical governments like we're seeing across the globe, Putin being one of the chieftains of that. But when you try to make a moral equivalency between what Hamas has done and what Israel is doing in response, I think that's a mistake. And the people around the world realize that when you look at the October 7th attacks and how horrible that was from a terrorist organization, a known terrorist organization, and then you try to morally equivocate and say, well, that's the same morally as what Israel is doing in response to that, I think the people around the world understand that's very different.
It's not moral equivalence, really. What it's doing is this warrant is applying the concepts of international law to one group of people and also to a different group of people. It's not comparing the two, and what it's saying is very different in terms of what Prime Minister Netanyahu and his defence minister are accused of doing, saying that Israel intentionally, systematically deprived the civilian population in all parts of Gaza, to quote from it, of objects indispensable to human survival. And at the beginning of the war, Yoav Gallant, the defence minister, said this. He said, we are putting a complete siege on Gaza. No electricity, no food, no water, no gas. It's all closed. I mean, supporters of the ICC would say that's on the record. The ICC has the Israeli defence minister and his boss, the prime minister, banged to rights there, doesn't he?
No, I don't think so, because that particular ICC warrant, the proposed warrant, says that they're going after Netanyahu for crimes against humanity, and you read portions of that. But the truth is, Hamas is the one that's morally and legally responsible for the atrocities that's happening in the Middle East. And when Israel says to the folks in Gaza, look, we're going to have to come in, and they did this here recently with Rafah. They said, we're going to have to come in with an offensive to eradicate who remains of Hamas. We're giving you a heads up, and we're letting you have time to get out. Boy, that's morally reasonable and legally justifiable, in my opinion.
There's a big dispute about the number of civilians who've died in Gaza, but the Israelis themselves say 16,000 Palestinian civilians have died. Others would say it's over 30,000. You are a man of proud of his Christian faith. What do you think Jesus Christ would have made of the deaths of 16,000 innocent men, women and children in Gaza?
Yeah, I think he would have mourned, and I think he does mourn for their lives, as do I. I think it's an atrocity. There's no question about that. But the question that we're debating tonight, the question that's on the table is, who's morally and legally responsible for that? And what you keep coming back to is the ICC is the body that has the right to say who is responsible for that legally. I disagree with that, and I disagree with their conclusion that Israel is the one that's legally and morally responsible for that. It's not. It is Hamas.
This is The World with me, Dominic Waghorn. After the break, a warning from the head of the UN that it's time to take stronger action against the godfathers of climate chaos.
Coming up on News at 10, a full roundup of today's moving D-Day commemorations. We'll unpick the political parties' claims about the cost of each other's policies, plus why Manchester City is taking on the Premier League and the consequences for other clubs. Join me at 10.
There's always more to the news than a headline. We want to discover, to delve a little deeper, to find out what's really going on. Explanation, analysis, the people at the heart of every story. I'm Neil Patterson, and this is the Sky News Daily Podcast. Alex Crawford joining us now from Ukraine.
Their personal possessions are all scattered around the place.
Our economics and data editor, Ed Conway, try and make sense of the big numbers for us.
Things can change incredibly quickly, and that's what they have done.
So, by the end, we'll hopefully all understand what's going on in the world just that little better. Available wherever you get your podcasts.
Welcome back. The UN Secretary-General has called for a global advertising ban on fossil fuel industries. It came as a damning report revealed how the world has been breaching the key 1.5 degree threshold for the last year. Tom Clark now reports.
You might be familiar with the number 1.5 degrees, the critical temperature threshold of climate warming that global negotiations are struggling to keep within reach. Well, today we got some sobering news. A recent runaway in global temperature starting in 2023 has now put the average global temperature above that 1.5 degree threshold, and by quite a bit. In fact, 1.63 degrees warmer than averages when the Industrial Revolution got going. Look at the data a different way and the amount of warming really stands out. These fainter lines show the average monthly temperatures in each decade since the 1940s. The gradual warming trend, driven largely by man-made greenhouse gas emissions, is really clear. But the last 12 calendar months, from June last year to May, really stand out, head and shoulders above previous record-breaking months. The good news, if you can call it that, is this is almost certainly a warming blip. We can expect slightly cooler months and years to come. Natural processes independent of man-made global warming have conspired to make the last 12 months unusually warm. Chief among them, El Nino, the natural cyclical phenomenon that releases vast amounts of heat stored in the Pacific Ocean into the atmosphere. Weird wind patterns over the North Atlantic and various other things have played a role too. A bump in the road, but one that leads to 1.5 degrees, and very soon. Here you can see how global average temperatures bumble around from year to year and how much warmer the most recent trend has been. But this blue line is the warming trend, and it's now an inevitability. Greenhouse gas emissions are still so high, and the latest estimates are we'll have burned through enough within the next 5 years to push us consistently above the 1.5 degree threshold around 2033. That's less than a decade from now. So where does that leave us?
Every tenth of degree above 1.5 leads to more and more misery for people, damage for the economies, costs in terms of floods, droughts, fires, heat waves. This we know as a 100% certainty. But moreover, what we must be honest about scientifically is that we simply do not know if the planet can cope beyond 1.5. We haven't been in that terrain for the past 100,000 years.
The key question for leaders is how much and for how long do we overshoot 1.5 degrees? Getting us back below it sometime this century almost certainly requires zero global emissions, as well as technologies to remove CO2 from the atmosphere. Carrying on as we are pushes warming closer to 3 degrees by the end of the century. The debate now really isn't about avoiding planet-altering climate change. It's all about how bad we're willing to let it get.
Well, that's all for tonight's The World. We'll bring you more special coverage of the D-Day 80th anniversary tomorrow. Stay tuned. Up next, it is news at 10.